Very quickly, the team knew the python was dead. Not probably dead. Not maybe injured and lying still in the reeds. Dead. The signal had flattened into that eerie kind of stillness field biologists learn to recognize before they even admit it out loud. The transmitter kept pulsing with perfect mechanical confidence, but the animal that had carried it through the swamp was no longer moving at all. When they reached the coordinates, the scene made even experienced researchers stop in place. No carcass, no blood, no drag marks through the mud, no churned water, no sign of a fight. It was as if a 13-foot predator had simply been erased, leaving behind only a tiny electronic heartbeat rising out of the Everglades. For years, the Burmese python had been the thing other animals vanished into. Now one had vanished itself. And the worst part was this: the transmitter was still inside something. That is where the story really begins. Not with the capture, not with the surgery, not with the spreadsheets and maps and grant paperwork. It begins with a clean radio pulse coming out of the swamp from a place where an apex predator should have been alive but wasn't. Because in South Florida, the Burmese python had built a reputation so absolute that almost nobody had ever seriously asked what might prey on it. These snakes swallowed deer whole. They took down alligators. They moved through wetlands like muscular shadows, hidden in grass, hidden in water, hidden in places human eyes could stare straight at and still miss. Entire stretches of the Everglades had been emptied by them. Mammals disappeared, birds disappeared, rabbits, raccoons, opossums, bobcats in some areas. All of it crashed under the pressure of a predator that simply did not belong there. If you spent enough time listening to biologists talk about Burmese pythons, you got the same impression every time. This was the top of the food chain now, the monster at the end of the equation. So, when researchers from the Conservancy of Southwest Florida began surgically implanting radio transmitters into these snakes, the point was not to discover a hidden enemy. The point was to study the invader, track its movements, learn its habits, understand how it used the swamp, figure out where it hunted, where it nested, where it crossed roads and canals, where it hid during cold snaps and wet seasons and brutal summer heat. The work itself was slow and unglamorous. Chest-deep water, thick heat, cypress knees underfoot, sawgrass sharp enough to slice. Skin. Hours moving toward a signal that sometimes led to a python coiled under brush so perfectly disguised it looked less like an animal than a distortion in the landscape. The kind of science that usually ends in careful reports, not in footage that leaves a room full of people staring at each other in silence. And for a while, that is exactly what it was. Routine tracking, clean data, movement patterns that made sense. The transmitters, after all, were not flimsy external tags clipped onto scales. They were implanted surgical devices, built to last, built to keep broadcasting through flooded wilderness for months. If one went quiet, the first assumption was a technical problem, a dead battery, a malfunction, maybe damage from the environment. What nobody expected was that the signal would remain strong while the python itself disappeared from the world around it. One snake was the first to go. Then another, then another. That detail matters. Once can be written off. Once is weather. Once is accident. Once is a freak event no one would ever expect to see again. But this was not once. This became a pattern. The pythons stopped moving. The signals flattened out. Teams pushed through the swamp to retrieve them, and each time they arrived at a place where there should have been a body, there was almost nothing. No dramatic kill site, no scattered remains, no scene that looked like the death of one of the largest predators in the Everglades, just the transmitter. Still pulsing, still there, still inside something else. Sit with that. For years, Florida had been living through one of the most unsettling wildlife stories on Earth. A giant snake from Southeast Asia had not merely established itself in the wild. It had remade a landscape. The exotic pet trade had brought young Burmese pythons into the United States by the thousands in the 1980s and 90s. They were beautiful as juveniles, manageable at first glance, an animal that looked exotic enough to own and harmless enough to misunderstand. But baby pythons do not stay babies. They become 10 feet long, then 15, then larger. They need space, heat, food, strength to manage them. Most owners never truly grasped what they had brought home until the animal outgrew the fantasy. Some were released on purpose, others escaped. Then Hurricane Andrew tore through South Florida in 1992, damaging breeding facilities and helping turn a slow leak into a true ecological disaster. And what the snakes found in the Everglades was not resistance. It was opportunity. The wetlands of South Florida are immense, tangled, wet, warm, and almost impossible to search completely. To a large constrictor, it is nearly perfect country. Water everywhere. Cover everywhere. Prey everywhere. No evolutionary history with the animals now trying to survive them. The python stepped into a food web that had not been built with it in mind and began feeding in a way the ecosystem simply could not absorb. Studies recorded catastrophic mammal declines in areas where pythons spread. In some places, raccoons fell by more than 99%. Opossums nearly vanished. Marsh rabbits and cottontails were wiped out locally. Bobcats dropped sharply. White-tailed deer were found in python stomachs. So were birds. So were alligators. An animal from another continent had slipped into one of North America's most iconic landscapes and started unmaking it from the inside. And for a long time, the professional opinion was grim in a very specific way. Not dramatic, not sensational, just grim. The kind of grim that settles in when people who actually know the field stop pretending easy solutions still exist. The state tried bounties, hunting programs, detection dogs, thermal drones, public removal contests, federal restrictions on import, research teams, tracking work, environmental DNA studies, long days in brutal conditions trying to catch up with something perfectly designed not to be found. And still, the numbers did not bend enough. The conclusion, spoken quietly or bluntly depending on who was talking, was that the pythons had become part of the Everglades in the worst possible sense. Not accepted, not balanced, established. The system was being eaten alive, and there was no obvious native force capable of stopping it. That was the settled explanation. Then the signal started going dark. When the first recovered evidence went to imaging, the story changed shape. On the screen was something that did not fit the logic anyone had brought into the room. The remains of a python inside the stomach of another animal. Spine intact, body swallowed whole. Transmitter still present, still broadcasting. In one case, the python measured nearly 13 feet and weighed more than 50 pounds. Its neck had been damaged, its body had been hidden under brush. Something had killed it, consumed it whole. Enough to take in the implanted device and then continued on its way through the swamp. Not scavenged it, not torn off chunks, not fed on a carcass already lying there, swallowed it. That one fact eliminated almost every easy answer. An alligator was the first thought because alligators dominate the Everglades' imagination. Ancient, powerful, perfectly capable of violence. But the evidence did not look like a gator kill. Alligators crush and twist. They death roll. They leave behind unmistakable wreckage, torn tissue, broken structures, water and mud churned by force. These python disappearances showed none of that, not even close. What about a Florida panther? Panthers kills, with a signature of their own. Bite marks, claw marks, damage to the skull or spine, clear traces of a mammal ambush. That was missing too. A black bear? Bears are strong and opportunistic, but bears do not usually swallow long, heavy constrictors whole, transmitter and all. The mechanism felt wrong. Hawks, owls, other snakes. Every possibility had a problem. Every theory hit the same wall. The physical evidence pointed to a predator that was doing something almost nobody had bothered to consider. So the team escalated the search in the most patient and frustrating way possible. Cameras, more cameras, directed at points where the signals had gone still. A silent field of suspicion spread across the swamp. Lens after lens aimed at mud, roots, reeds, shallow water, leaf litter. And then came the long stretch that breaks most mysteries before they become stories. Nothing. Empty footage, wind, water, wading birds. The ordinary life of a wetland continuing as if nothing astonishing had happened there at all. Hours of it, days of it. The kind of footage that makes even committed researchers doubt the shape of their own question. Then one clip finally answered it. Not fully, not cleanly, but enough to rearrange the whole investigation. The predator was not an alligator, not a panther, not a bear, not some giant unknown beast rising out of the swamp. It was a snake, native, venomous, familiar to every field biologist in South Florida. A Florida cottonmouth. That is the moment the story stops sounding like a normal invasive species case and starts sounding like something older and stranger, because the cottonmouth was not some exotic newcomer. It was not a species drafted in from somewhere else. It had always been there, coiled in the roots and black water and leaf litter of the wetlands, long before the first python ever entered them. A heavy-bodied pit viper, built for semi-aquatic life, perfectly at home in cypress swamp, marsh edge, and flooded woodland, an animal that most people know only from the flash of that famous white mouth and the warning it implies. A snake many walkers step around with fear, but not with respect for what it can do. The footage showed one nearly, invisible at the water's edge, thick, dark, motionless in the way ambush predators vanish by refusing to announce themselves as alive. Then movement, fast enough to make the moment feel less like a struggle than a correction. A juvenile Burmese python was seized before it had time to turn its own body into a weapon. The cottonmouth bit, released, and what followed was not chaos, it was method. Later, the snake began swallowing the python whole, working from the tail, walking its jaws forward inch by inch until the invader disappeared down its throat. No spectacle, no theater, just an efficient local predator handling prey in a shape it clearly understood. That was the first deep crack in the old explanation. Because if a cottonmouth could do that once, The question was no longer whether a native predator could attack a Burmese python. The question became how many times this had already happened without anyone noticing. How often had field teams walked past the very species doing the job because they had trained their attention on larger, louder suspects? How many signals had gone dark before the pattern registered? How much of the Everglades was already fighting back in small, hidden ways, while the public story remained one of total native helplessness? If you want to know the moment this stopped feeling like a freak accident and started looking like a pattern, stay with me, because that is where the whole meaning of this turns. To understand why the cottonmouth matters, you have to understand what it actually is. Not just a venomous snake in a swamp, a specialist in the exact kind of ambush the python invasion made possible. Cottonmouths are pit vipers. That means they have heat-sensing organs between the eyes and nostrils that detect infrared radiation. They do not need bright daylight. They do not need movement the way human vision does. In darkness, in murky cover, even in a place where camouflage defeats search teams standing feet away, they can read the faint heat signature of prey against the cooler background around it. A juvenile python hidden from people is not necessarily hidden from a cottonmouth. And then there is the venom. A python kills by constriction. It has to wrap, hold, squeeze, and survive the physical contest long enough to shut the fight down. A cottonmouth does not need to wrestle that way. It strikes, injects venom that destroys tissue and blood cells, then waits. Against a young python, that is a terrible advantage. The fight can be over before the constrictor ever gets to use the one weapon people fear most in it. More than that, cottonmouths are not strangers to this kind of prey. They eat other snakes as part of their natural diet. They are snake eaters already. The Burmese python was not introducing a new body plan to them. It was stepping into an old category. Think about how different that is from the public image of the Everglades invasion. We tend to picture the python as an unstoppable outsider, too large, too strong, too alien to fit anywhere except at the top. But ecosystems do not always respond at the level of myth. They respond through contact, through edges, through timing, through small, vulnerable windows. A cottonmouth does not need to defeat the biggest python in Florida to matter. It needs to identify the stage where the python is edible, the moment when the invader is old enough to be worth the energy, but not yet too large to kill safely. That is not cinematic. It is better than cinematic. It is ecological. And once that possibility entered the story, other evidence began lining up behind it. The Transmitter Project had not been telling only one story. Of the monitored pythons in the study, several were killed by American alligators. That detail alone changes the emotional scale of what was happening. Not because alligators taking pythons was completely unheard of, but because the context mattered. One of the gators involved was not a giant monster out of legend, around 9 feet long, a perfectly ordinary adult alligator by Florida standards, which means the pushback was not limited to extreme outlier individuals. It suggested that normal residents of the swamp, the animals already everywhere in that system, were still very much capable of making pythons pay a price. Then came another piece of footage that seemed, on first hearing, almost too neat to be true. A bobcat attacking a python nest, not scavenging abandoned eggs, not stumbling across a ruined site after something else had happened. A live, direct raid. The bobcat approached a nesting female Burmese python, drove her back, and began taking the eggs, one by one. If you know what a nesting python represents, that scene lands harder than it sounds. A female protecting her clutch is defending the future of her entire lineage. The eggs are the whole investment, the whole biological bet. And a native mammal much smaller than she is walked in and disrupted it anyway. That mattered not just because eggs were lost, but because behavior was being revealed. This was not merely survival under pressure. It looked like adaptation in real time. A local predator discovering that a python nest was not an impossible threat, but an exploitable opportunity. The kind of thing textbooks like to smooth into long time scales. Generation after generation. Slow pressure, gradual change. But real animals do not wait for elegant theory when a food source appears in front of them. They learn, they test, they fail sometimes, they succeed enough to keep trying. And the story kept widening. Raptors taking smaller pythons, hawks and owls removing juveniles before they could grow into the huge constrictors that empty out food webs. Bears documented killing pythons, panthers too. Alligators in the water, cottonmouths in the leaf litter, bobcats at the nests, birds from above. None of it coordinated, none of it planned. No grand ecosystem meeting, no dramatic revenge of nature, just separate native species encountering the same invader from different angles and arriving, in their own ways, at the same conclusion. This can be eaten. This can be killed. This can be robbed. This can be stopped, at least sometimes. That is the part of the story people want to turn into an ending. The Everglades fights back. Nature heals itself. The invader meets resistance. And it is tempting because emotionally it feels like justice. The native ecosystem everyone had written off as overwhelmed suddenly looks less helpless. The python is no longer an untouchable apex machine. The room changes. The mood changes. Hope enters. But hope is not the same thing as victory. Because while the native coalition was revealing itself, another number kept hanging over all of it. And that number is the reason the scientists closest to this work still talk carefully. A female Burmese python can lay a large clutch of eggs. A dozen, several dozen, sometimes more. She coils around them, defends them, generates heat by shivering her muscles to help incubation. The reproductive engine here is ruthless. Even if predators take many juveniles, the population does not need most of them to survive. It needs enough. Enough to reach breeding age, enough to lay the next clutches. Enough for the curve to keep compounding while human search teams are still pushing through miles of impossible terrain trying to find a fraction of what is out there. That is why this is not a simple underdog story. The cottonmouth footage is real. The alligator kills matter. The bobcat nest raid matters. Every python removed by people matters. But then you run the arithmetic forward. Suppose a nest is hit hard. Suppose several hatchlings are taken by raptors. Suppose one juvenile disappears into a cottonmouth. Suppose another is eaten by a gator. The survivors still move out into a landscape vast enough to hide them. They still grow fast. They still enter a system where prey remains abundant in many places, and where detection is so difficult that researchers themselves can walk within feet of a snake and miss it completely. The reproductive math does not need perfection. It only needs leakage. And that is the brutal part of the aftermath in your title. Not simply that something new is swallowing Florida's giant pythons. It is that even this astonishing pushback may still not be enough. The swamp has found ways to hit back. The question is whether it can hit back faster than the invasion expands. Before I show you why that question is bigger than one cottonmouth or one nest raid, if you are new here, this is exactly the kind of story this channel follows when the data stops agreeing with the old script. Because the old script was simple. The Burmese python arrived. Native species collapsed. Florida responded too slowly. The invader became dominant. End of story. Clean. Harsh. Easy to summarize. But the actual field record looks less like a straight line and more like a hidden war. And hidden wars are harder to narrate because the important events are usually small. A strike in darkness. A nest raided at the edge of a camera frame. A transmitter pinging from inside the wrong animal. The decisive thing is not always the biggest thing. Sometimes it is the overlooked thing. Take the cottonmouth again. The more you stare at that animal's role in this, the more obvious it becomes that people were asking the wrong question for years. They were asking what large, charismatic predator could match a giant invasive constrictor. What creature could stand toe-to-toe with the python on the same dramatic terms? But ecosystems rarely solve problems by producing mirror images. They solve them through pressure points, timing, niche overlap, vulnerability. The cottonmouth is not the python's equal in mythic scale. It does not need to be. It only needs to own one part of the swamp better than the invader does. And it does. It belongs there. It knows that water, that cover, that edge habitat. It understands that darkness in a way the python did not evolve to fear in Florida. That is why researchers describe some of these findings with something close to disbelief. Not because nature fighting back is unimaginable. Because the mechanism of the fight was so ordinary once you finally saw it. The answer had been living in the same field sites all along. People had been stepping around it for years. The cottonmouth was not introduced as a solution. It was not trained. It was not managed into the role. It simply encountered a new prey item that fit within an old behavioral pattern and began feeding. There is something deeply humbling in that. Humans built grant programs, detection networks, organized hunts, policy frameworks, public awareness campaigns, all of which matter, all of which are necessary, all of which represent real effort against an enormous problem. But while that bureaucratic machinery turned, the swamp itself did not wait. The alligator kept being an alligator. The cottonmouth kept being a cottonmouth. The bobcat, somewhere along the line, learned that a python nest was not untouchable. The system was improvising below the level of human attention. That does not mean the system will save itself. Be careful there. It means the story is not one of total passivity. The Everglades is not merely a victim landscape waiting for rescue from outside. It is also a living set of relationships, and some of those relationships are now bending toward resistance. That distinction matters because it changes what scientists look for next. Not miracle answers, signals, rates, patterns. Evidence that these predation events are not isolated curiosities, but a meaningful force. And that is where the Transmitter Project becomes so strangely powerful. A radio tag is not dramatic on its own. It is just hardware. Tiny, clinical, cold. But when you scatter enough of them across a landscape and wait, they start telling stories no single human observer could ever catch in person. One dark signal might be chance. Several start to suggest process. A cluster of disappearances in a region. A repeat pattern in habitat. Type. The recovery of transmitters from inside native predators. A camera clip at just the right moment. Bit by bit, the Everglades stops looking like a place where pythons are simply expanding unchecked and starts looking like a place where a hidden selection pressure is forming around them. Now imagine what that could mean over time. Not next month, not in some neat movie ending, over years, over generations. If cottonmouths continue to exploit juvenile pythons, then one slice of the invasion becomes more dangerous to the invader than researchers thought. If alligators regularly kill medium-sized pythons, then another slice narrows. If bobcats and other mammals learn to target nests, then reproduction itself takes hits at a point of maximum leverage. If raptors continue to lift exposed juveniles, then the earliest growth stages remain costly. Each pressure on its own may be insufficient. Together, they begin to resemble something more important than isolated predation. They begin to resemble a filter. The big reveal is not that one cottonmouth swallowed one python. The big reveal is that the Everglades may already be building a multi-species filter against Burmese pythons. One kill, one nest raid, one darkened signal at a time. And if that is true, the whole emotional meaning of this invasion shifts. Because for years, the python represented a kind of ecological finality, a verdict, a statement that once an invasive apex predator gains enough ground in a place this large and this difficult to search, the native system can do little but absorb damage, but the data suggests that may be too simple. The native system is not fully matching the python in size. It is surrounding it in stages, hitting eggs, hatchlings, juveniles, and sometimes larger individuals through different species using different methods. Not one answer, several partial ones. That may be the only kind of answer nature ever produces. Still, this is where honesty matters most. Some researchers now believe these native predation events are more common than earlier records suggested. The data suggests a broad front of resistance, but resistance is not the same as reversal. No serious scientist is looking at a few documented kills and announcing the invasion solved. That would be fantasy. The python population remains enormous. Detection remains brutally difficult. Removal efforts, though important, still touch only part of what is out there. The Everglades is vast enough to hide success and failure at the same time. In one patch of swamp, a cottonmouth may be digesting a juvenile python whole. Less than a mile away, another female python may be coiled around a fresh clutch that will send new hatchlings in every direction. That image is the entire conflict. One native predator winning in darkness, one invasive clutch hatching in darkness, hope and overwhelm occupying the same water at the same time. And maybe that is why the story hits people so hard. Not because it offers neat reassurance, but because it refuses to. It gives you just enough evidence to feel the possibility of comeback, then forces you to hold that possibility against the scale of the problem. A few hidden victories do not erase decades of ecological damage. The raccoons do not instantly return. The rabbits do not repopulate because one camera caught one raid. The ecosystem does not forgive the invasion because a cottonmouth did what it has always done. Yet those things matter precisely because they are not enough on their own. They are the first signs that the system has not surrendered. That matters for us too, in a way that goes beyond one swamp in Florida. Because there is a tendency in modern environmental stories to divide everything into two emotional options. Either the system is doomed or it is healing. Either collapse is unstoppable or nature is bouncing back. But real landscapes almost never behave that cleanly. They struggle, they adapt, they lose ground, they take some back, they surprise the experts, they hide important changes in places almost nobody is looking. The Everglades is not teaching us that invasions are easy to reverse. It is teaching us that living systems are more cunning than our summaries of them. Sometimes the creature we overlook is the creature carrying the most interesting answer, and there is something almost ancient in that idea. A massive outsider arrives, seems invincible, rewrites the rules of the place, and everyone begins speaking as if the old order is finished. Then, in the roots and shadows and black water, the local world starts testing that claim, quietly, without permission, without spectacle. A bite here, a nest raid there, a signal going dark. The larger story changing not through one heroic battle, but through 100 unseen corrections. What keeps researchers going back is not certainty. It is exactly that uncertainty. The study is still running. The cameras are still out there. The transmitter networks are still listening for the next clue, the next motionless signal, the next recovered device from inside the wrong stomach. And every one of those points adds detail to a picture that did not exist a few years ago. Ian, Bartoszek and others are no longer only tracking pythons. They are also tracking the things that are tracking pythons. The question is widened. Not where do the invaders move, but where are they getting hit? By what? At what stage? With what frequency? Under what conditions? That is how a mystery becomes a model. There's also a human humility built into that shift that I find impossible to ignore. We entered this crisis assuming the most important intelligence in the system would be ours, our management plans, our data layers, our traps and tools, and regulatory response. And again, those matter. They are real. But the first undeniable proof that the invader was vulnerable came partly from animals that had never read the narrative we were trapped inside. The cottonmouth did not know the python was supposed to be too dominant to touch. The bobcat did not know the nest was meant to be off limits. The alligator did not care what the official explanation had settled on. They simply encountered a pressure in their environment and responded with the tools evolution had already given them. If you think about that long enough, the whole thing becomes less like a wildlife headline and more like a lesson in perception. We miss what we are not prepared to see. For years, researchers were rightly focused on the damage pythons caused. The scale of that damage was real, but attention has a cost. You can look so hard at one dominant story that the counter story happens under your feet. The Everglades did not become safer the moment a cottonmouth was caught on camera swallowing a python. But our understanding of the Everglades changed. Suddenly, the system looked less like a conquered space and more like contested ground. Contested ground is not victory, but it is not surrender either. And maybe that is the hardest emotional note to hold. People want this to end one way or the other. Either the native predators will save the swamp, or the python has already won. But the truth right now is more demanding than both of those. The truth is that the fight is still open. The answer is still being written by field seasons, transmitters, predator behavior, rainfall, nesting success, hunting pressure, and the impossible geometry of a wetland too large for any one perspective to capture whole. We are not watching a finished story. We are watching a live system negotiate with an invader in real time. Some nights in South Florida, that negotiation looks almost hopeful. A cottonmouth lies under cover and senses just enough warmth. A strike lands, venom works. Another juvenile python disappears from the equation. A bobcat reaches a nest before the eggs hatch. A hawk spots movement in an exposed patch of marsh. An alligator meets a snake in water and wins. Small victories, quiet ones, hardly visible unless a camera is there or a transmitter keeps talking from inside the wrong body.